When an empath absorbs the narcissist's darkness and survives, Carl Jung discovered something unsettling. They don't simply heal. They transform into something the narcissist never anticipated. The person who once absorbed every projection becomes unreachable. The soul that carried everyone's shadow develops an immunity to manipulation. And most disturbing of all, their very presence begins to force others to confront the darkness they were projecting outward. This transformation doesn't arrive with anger. It doesn't come with closure conversations or dramatic exits. It arrives quietly, with a terrifying clarity. There is a moment when you stop explaining yourself to people who were never listening. A moment when you stop absorbing emotions that were never yours. And most devastating of all, a moment when you become unavailable for emotional emergencies that once controlled your entire life. Carl Jung called this individuation. But this word doesn't capture the violence of the process. What truly occurs is the birth of psychological sovereignty. What emerges is not the same empath who entered the narcissist's web. It is a different archetype entirely. One Jung documented carefully, but rarely spoke about publicly. To understand this transformation, you must understand what the empath was before it happened. Jung observed that highly sensitive individuals often become what he called shadow containers. People unconsciously shaped to absorb psychological material that others refuse to face. He wrote that the healthy man does not torture others. Usually, it is the tortured who become torturers. But empaths form a third category. They absorb the torture without becoming torturers themselves. This is not virtue, it is conditioning. From early life, the empath learns that safety depends on emotional attunement. They become experts at sensing shifts in mood, tension, silence, and emotional weather. They learn to carry what others cannot hold. And over time, this sensitivity becomes a psychological function. Jung called this participation mystique, an unconscious merger between self and other, a state where boundaries dissolve and emotions become shared territory. In this state, the empath cannot distinguish between what they feel and what they absorb. They experience other people's rage as anxiety, other people's shame as self-doubt, other people's emptiness as depression. The narcissist recognizes this vulnerability instinctively, not consciously, but accurately. They sense someone who can hold what they refuse to process, someone who can contain their denied shadow, someone who will carry their psychological waste while they walk away unburdened. And so the dynamic forms. The narcissist projects, the empath absorbs. The narcissist disowns, the empath carries. The narcissist avoids, the empath feels. Jung understood that projection is not random. People project what they cannot tolerate within themselves, and empaths, by their nature, make ideal containers for this material. But here is the part most people never understand. This exploitation is not meaningless. It serves an evolutionary purpose. Jung wrote that the greatest problems of life are not solved. They are outgrown. The empath-narcissist dynamic forces this outgrowing in the most brutal way possible. The narcissist represents what Jung called the shadow denied, all the darkness they refuse to acknowledge, all the emptiness they cannot sit with, all the shame they will not face. The empath becomes the repository for this denied shadow. And in carrying it, something irreversible begins. The empath does not simply suffer. They begin to develop what can only be called shadow literacy, an ability to read psychological darkness fluently, to sense manipulation before it is spoken, to feel dishonesty before it is expressed, to recognize emotional extraction at the level of the nervous system. This is not learned intellectually. It is learned through immersion. Jung called this descent the night sea journey, a symbolic death, a descent into psychological hell where identity dissolves and illusion collapses. For the empath, this journey is not metaphorical. It is lived. You do not merely witness darkness, you are forced to live inside it. And that is where this story truly begins. Jung warned that there is no coming to consciousness without pain. But for the empath inside a narcissistic dynamic, this pain is not symbolic. It is invasive. It enters the psyche and begins to rewrite identity from the inside. What begins as emotional exhaustion slowly becomes something more corrosive. The narcissist's shame becomes your self-doubt. Their rage becomes your anxiety. Their emptiness settles into your chest as a quiet, persistent depression. You are not reacting to your own inner world anymore. You are metabolizing someone else's. Jung called this psychological poisoning, a state where foreign psychic material overwhelms the ego until the original self begins to dissolve. And unlike ordinary suffering, this kind of poisoning creates confusion. You no longer know where you end and where they begin. This is why empaths often feel like they are losing themselves, because in a very real psychological sense they are. Jung identified this stage as the negredo, the blackening phase of psychological alchemy, a descent where everything that once felt stable collapses into chaos. The negredo is not sadness, it is disintegration. Your values feel hollow. Your empathy feels dangerous. Your intuition feels unreliable. Your sense of self becomes fragmented under the weight of constant projection. You question your memory. You doubt your perceptions. You feel guilty for emotions that do not belong to you. And worst of all, you begin to believe that this darkness is who you are. Jung wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But the empath at this stage cannot accept themselves because they cannot find themselves. They have absorbed so much foreign material that their authentic self feels buried, silenced, erased. This is where many empaths break permanently. Some numb themselves, some harden, some lose their sensitivity entirely. Others remain trapped in cycles of emotional servitude, mistaking survival for love. But Jung observed something extraordinary about those who survive this stage. The psyche develops defenses, not conscious defenses, not affirmations or coping strategies, something far more primitive and powerful, an immune response. Jung believed the psyche, like the body, has an instinct for self-preservation. When foreign psychological material overwhelms the system, the unconscious begins to adapt. It starts to recognize patterns. It learns the signature of manipulation. It develops what can only be described as shadow antibodies. This is why survivors of narcissistic abuse often say, "I can feel manipulation instantly now." This is not intuition, it is adaptation. Your nervous system has learned the taste of psychological toxicity, and once learned, it cannot be unlearned. Jung wrote that knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of others. But empaths do not merely know darkness, they have lived inside it. This immersion creates a profound shift. You no longer process emotions abstractly, you feel them somatically, in the body, in the gut, in the chest. Your system rejects what once passed unnoticed. Manipulation feels physically repulsive. Gaslighting creates nausea. Emotional extraction triggers an instinctive withdrawal. This is not fear, it is recognition. But before this immunity stabilizes, there is one final collapse, the most brutal stage of all. Jung called it ego death. The moment the false self disintegrates completely. For empaths, this false self is built around being helpful, being understanding, being endlessly available, being emotionally safe for others at the cost of themselves. This identity cannot survive the negredo. It collapses under the weight of betrayal, exhaustion, and disillusionment. The breaking point does not arrive with drama. It arrives quietly. You wake up one morning and feel nothing. Your empathy feels dead. Your hope feels poisoned. Your desire to fix, rescue, or explain has evaporated. You look in the mirror and do not recognize who is looking back. Jung understood this moment precisely. He wrote that one must lose their way to find themselves. But in this void there is terror. Because without the false self there appears to be nothing left. No role, no purpose, no identity. This is where many people panic and rebuild the old patterns. They apologize, they reattach, they re-enter the cycle. But the empath who continues does something radically different. They remain in the void. They stop reaching outward. They stop explaining. They stop performing emotional labor. They allow the false self to die completely. Jung wrote, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." But this choice only becomes possible after the collapse. The narcissist, in their relentless attack on your identity, becomes the unwitting destroyer of your false self. They think they are consuming you, but they are clearing the ground. This is not healing yet. This is purification through destruction. And what comes next changes everything. Jung understood something that few psychologists ever dared to articulate. After the ego collapses, something older begins to surface. Not a personality, not a coping mechanism, something archetypal. Jung called it the self, the organizing center of the psyche that exists beneath conditioning, trauma, and identity. It does not emerge gently. It emerges when nothing false remains. This is why the empath's rebirth feels nothing like healing. It feels alien. You do not feel lighter, you feel clearer, sharper, unreachable. The need to explain yourself disappears. The impulse to justify your boundaries vanishes. You stop negotiating your reality with people who were never interested in truth. Jung observed that after prolonged exposure to shadow, certain individuals develop what he called psychological sight, the ability to perceive unconscious dynamics instantly, without effort. This is where the empath becomes something new. Not healed, integrated. I call this archetype the shadow walker. The shadow walker is not afraid of darkness. They have lived inside it. They do not flinch at manipulation because they recognize its structure. They do not personalize projection because they can see its source. Jung wrote that the unconscious reveals itself in patterns, and the shadow walker has memorized those patterns at a cellular level. Charm feels calculated. Victimhood feels strategic. Love bombing feels hollow. Guilt feels mechanical. What once confused you now appears almost transparent. This is not cynicism, it is literacy. You have learned the language of shadow. Jung believed that consciousness evolves through conflict, and the empath-narcissist dynamic is one of the most brutal accelerators of awareness in psychology. While others theorize about darkness, you were forced to carry it. While others debate manipulation, you survived it. While others deny shadow, you became fluent in it. And fluency changes posture. You no longer lean forward emotionally. You no longer offer yourself as a container. You no longer unconsciously merge. Participation mystique dissolves. You feel where others end. You feel where you begin. This boundary is not rigid, it is alive. Jung called this state psychological sovereignty, a condition where the individual is no longer governed by unconscious forces, either their own or others. But here is what makes the shadow walker terrifying to unconscious people. You no longer provide feedback loops. You do not react, you do not explain, you do not defend. You simply see. And seeing disrupts projection. Jung observed that projection requires a surface, someone willing to absorb, someone willing to carry, someone willing to doubt themselves. When that surface disappears, projection collapses inward. This is why people change around you. Some become nervous, some become hostile. Some suddenly accuse you of being cold, distant, or changed. Jung understood this reaction perfectly. He wrote that everything that irritates us about others leads us to our own unconscious. But most people do not want awareness, they want relief. And you no longer provide relief through self-erasure. Your presence now creates friction, not because you attack, but because you refuse to disappear. This is the constellation effect Jung described, when one person's consciousness level forces others to confront theirs. The shadow walker does not chase truth. Truth follows them. And here is the paradox Jung found most fascinating. The empath becomes powerful not by hardening but by integrating, not by closing the heart but by anchoring it. You still feel deeply, but you are no longer porous. You still perceive pain, but you no longer absorb it. You still love, but you no longer abandon yourself to be loved. This integration produces a presence that cannot be manipulated, because manipulation requires unconsciousness, and you are no longer unconscious. Jung wrote that until the unconscious is made conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. The shadow walker has stepped outside fate. Patterns that once repeated now stop. Dynamics that once trapped you now collapse on contact. Not because you fight them, but because you no longer participate. This is where the narcissist begins to panic. Their tactics no longer land. Their hooks no longer attach. Their narratives no longer infect. They feel it immediately. They may escalate. They may provoke. They may attempt to pull you back into emotional chaos. But nothing connects. You are no longer available for extraction. This is not revenge. This is evolution. Jung believed that some individuals are forced into individuation through suffering rather than insight. They do not choose the path. The path chooses them. The empath who survives narcissistic abuse becomes one of these individuals. You did not seek transformation. You were forged by it. And what emerges is not a victim, not a healer, not a rescuer, but a sovereign. And this sovereignty is only the beginning. Jung observed a moment in individuation that almost no one is prepared for. The moment when projection stops working. Not gradually, abruptly. He called this projection withdrawal, the point at which the psyche refuses to host what does not belong to it. For the empath who survived the narcissist, this moment feels strange. There is no surge of confidence, no dramatic empowerment. There is silence, internal quiet, a sudden absence of noise. The voices that once lived in your head are gone. The guilt that once compelled you to over-explain dissolves. The reflex to rescue disappears. You are not numb. You are insulated. Jung believed the psyche develops immunity the same way the body does, through exposure, through survival, through learning what is foreign. This is psychological immunity. You no longer recognize manipulation emotionally. You recognize it structurally. You can feel when a conversation is not about connection. You can sense when someone is fishing for control. You can detect when sympathy is being weaponized. Not because you are suspicious, but because your nervous system has learned the pattern. The narcissist relied on your participation, on your empathy, on your confusion. But immunity ends participation. And this is where their world begins to collapse. They speak, nothing lands. They provoke, nothing moves. They guilt, nothing bends. Jung noted that unconscious people depend on reaction the way parasites depend on hosts. Without reaction, the system starves. This is why your calm unsettles them more than anger ever could. Anger confirms connection. Calm confirms separation. You are no longer inside the emotional ecosystem that once fed them. And something terrifying happens when a narcissist can no longer project. They are forced to feel their own shadow. The rage they placed in you returns to them. The emptiness they offloaded comes back. The shame they buried resurfaces. Jung warned that most people will do anything to avoid this confrontation, including attacking the mirror. This is why some people turn cold. Others become cruel. Others accuse you of changing. But you did not change, you withdrew consent. Jung understood that consent is the invisible glue of unconscious dynamics. When consent is removed, the structure collapses. This is why you now feel untouchable. Not invincible, untouchable. You are no longer accessible through emotion. You are no longer reachable through guilt. You are no longer programmable through fear of abandonment. You exist inside yourself. This is psychological sovereignty in action. And sovereignty has consequences. Some people disappear. Some relationships evaporate. Some connections dissolve without explanation. Jung called this psychic realignment, when the psyche reorganizes itself around truth instead of survival. The people who only knew you as an emotional resource cannot survive this realignment. They were bonded to your wound, not to your essence. But others appear, quieter, more grounded, more self-contained. These are individuated souls, people who do not need you to shrink in order to feel whole. Jung believed individuation creates selective resonance. You stop attracting those who feed on fragmentation. You begin attracting those who can meet wholeness. But here's the part Jung rarely spoke about publicly. This stage is lonely. Not because you are alone, but because you are no longer available for unconscious intimacy. You cannot pretend. You cannot unsee. You cannot return to emotional chaos without feeling it immediately. But this loneliness is not empty. It is clear. And clarity becomes home. The shadow walker does not isolate out of fear. They withdraw out of discernment. You begin to value peace over connection, truth over harmony, presence over performance. This is not detachment, this is integration. Jung wrote that the individuated person does not float above life. They stand firmly inside it. You still care, but you no longer bleed. You still feel, but you no longer dissolve. And the world feels this shift instantly. Your energy no longer asks, it declares. Not with words, with posture, with silence, with refusal. This is why manipulation no longer works. Because manipulation requires access. And access has been revoked. What comes next is not withdrawal, it is embodiment. And that is where the transformation reaches its most visible form. When one psyche becomes organized around truth, it silently reorganizes the field around it. You do not announce this change, you do not explain it, you simply arrive differently. And the room feels it. This is where people begin to react in ways that confuse you. Some become strangely defensive. Others become overly polite. Some withdraw without explanation. Others suddenly try to reinsert themselves into your life. Jung understood this reaction precisely. He observed that an individuated person activates unconscious material in others simply by existing. Not by teaching, not by confronting, by presence. Your nervous system no longer resonates with chaos. Your emotional field no longer stabilizes dysregulation. Your silence no longer absorbs anxiety. And this creates disturbance. Unconscious people rely on emotional environments that allow them to avoid themselves. They need others to carry what they refuse to feel. They need noise. They need reaction. They need emotional access. Your presence removes that option. Jung wrote that when projection collapses, the unconscious seeks a new host. If it cannot find one, it turns inward. This is why some people become hostile around you. Your calm forces them to face themselves. They feel exposed, not judged, exposed. You are no longer mirroring their desired self-image. You are reflecting their actual state. This is the moment many relationships fracture. Not because you did something wrong, but because the contract was never conscious. The relationship was built on your availability to absorb, your willingness to soothe, your readiness to regulate. Once that function ends, the bond has no structure. Jung warned that unconscious bonds dissolve violently when awareness enters. This is not cruelty. It is entropy correcting itself. And here is where the empath often doubts themselves. You wonder if you became cold, if you lost compassion, if you are abandoning people. But Jung was clear. Withdrawal from unconscious entanglement is not abandonment, it is differentiation. You are not leaving people, you are leaving roles. The role of emotional processor, the role of stabilizer, the role of silent container. These roles were never love, they were survival adaptations. And survival adaptations expire once safety is internalized. This is why your presence now feels heavier, not oppressive, dense. Jung described this as psychic gravity. When a person becomes centered in the self, their energy gains weight. Not force, weight. People feel it immediately. They speak differently around you, they hesitate, they test, they pause. Not because you intimidate them, but because they can no longer bypass themselves. This is the paradox of integration. The more peaceful you become, the more disruptive your presence feels to those who remain fragmented. You are not attacking the system, you are revealing it. And revelation feels like threat to unconscious structures. Jung noted that many people mistake disruption for danger. They confuse discomfort with harm. They confuse exposure with aggression. This is why some label you as changed, as distant, as different. They are right. You are no longer accessible through dysfunction. But others respond differently. They soften, they breathe, they feel safe. These are the ones who are already oriented toward consciousness. They experience your presence as grounding rather than threatening. Jung believed individuation creates polarity. You repel those who require unconsciousness. You attract those who value awareness. This is not preference, it is resonance. And resonance is not negotiable. The shadow walker does not choose who feels comfortable around them. They simply stop managing other people's emotional reactions. This is one of the final losses, the loss of emotional responsibility for others. You no longer track the room. You no longer adjust your tone. You no longer preempt discomfort. You let people feel what they feel. Jung considered this an advanced stage of ethical development, allowing others their emotional experience without interference. It is not indifference, it is respect. And respect terrifies those who depended on your self-erasure. Because respect includes boundaries, and boundaries reveal truth. This is why your presence now feels like a line, not drawn aggressively, simply present. People must decide how to stand in relation to it. Some step closer, some step away, some try to erase it, but you no longer move. Jung wrote that the individuated person becomes an axis. Life organizes itself around them rather than through them. This is the moment you stop orbiting others' needs and begin occupying your own center. What comes next is not isolation. It is alignment. And alignment changes everything. Jung identified an archetype that only emerges after extreme psychological testing. One that does not appear through study, belief, or imitation. It appears through survival. I call it the shadow walker. The shadow walker is not someone who studies darkness. It is someone who lived inside it and returned without becoming it. Jung wrote that a person who has not passed through the inferno of their passions has never overcome them. The shadow walker has passed through, slowly, painfully, without witnesses. This is why your transformation feels lonely. Not because people abandoned you, but because you can no longer meet them where they live. Jung called this the loneliness of individuation, the solitude that emerges when the psyche organizes itself around truth rather than belonging. You are no longer driven by approval. You are no longer motivated by fear of rejection. You are no longer sustained by emotional fusion. And this removes you from the collective rhythm. Most people live through unconscious agreements. They bond through shared avoidance, shared denial, shared distraction. You no longer participate in these agreements. Not because you reject people, but because your nervous system cannot return to unconsciousness. Jung understood that once awareness crosses a certain threshold, regression becomes psychologically impossible. You can pretend, you can comply, but you cannot unsee. This creates a strange grief. You miss people who are still alive. You feel distance in conversations that once felt intimate. You sense a widening gap that cannot be explained without sounding cruel. Jung warned that the individuated person often appears arrogant or detached to the collective, not because they believe they are superior, but because they are no longer synchronized. Your timing is different now. Your silence is different. Your attention has weight. And weight creates distance. The shadow walker does not seek isolation. Isolation finds them when unconscious bonds dissolve. But this solitude is not empty, it is precise. You begin to hear yourself again, not the voice that adapts, but the one that knows. Jung believed this stage was necessary, because the self cannot emerge in noise. You needed the silence. You needed the distance. You needed the collapse of false closeness. Only then could the authentic orientation appear. This is where many empaths panic. They mistake solitude for failure, distance for loss, stillness for emptiness. But Jung was clear. Solitude is not absence of connection, it is the absence of distortion. You are no longer deluded by projection. You are no longer flooded by others' emotional debris. You are no longer negotiating your existence. And in this quiet, something stabilizes. You stop scanning. You stop bracing. You stop anticipating rupture. Your nervous system begins to rest for the first time. This is the gift hidden inside loneliness. Jung wrote that the individuated person becomes their own ground. They do not require constant validation. They do not require emotional mirrors. They do not require performance. They exist. And existence becomes enough. The shadow walker does not chase meaning. Meaning consolidates around them. Not dramatically, gradually. You notice that fewer people reach for you, but those who do arrive differently. They are calmer, more honest, less demanding. They do not need you to carry them. They want to walk beside you. This is how alignment begins. Jung believed that depth selects its own audience not through exclusion, but through resonance. You are no longer available to everyone, but you are finally available to yourself. And that availability becomes the foundation for every future bond. Not fusion, not sacrifice, but presence. This is the quiet victory of individuation. There comes a moment when the empath is no longer emotionally available, not because they became cold, but because they became conscious. Jung understood this transition deeply. He saw that availability without discernment is not love, it is compulsion. For most of your life, your availability was automatic. If someone needed, you answered. If someone hurt, you absorbed. If someone collapsed, you carried. You believed this was compassion. You believed this was goodness. You believed this was who you were. But Jung warned that unconscious compassion becomes self-erasure. The transformation begins when something inside you stops responding on command. A message arrives. A crisis is presented. An emotional pull is activated. And nothing moves inside you. Not numbness, not avoidance, but clarity. You recognize the pattern before it unfolds. You sense the manipulation before it is spoken. You feel the hook before it lands. And you do not take it. This is where others begin to panic. Because they were not connected to your presence, they were connected to your availability. Jung called this participation mystique, an unconscious bond where one person's emotional regulation depends on another's nervous system. When you step out of this bond, the system destabilizes. People accuse you of changing, of becoming distant, of losing empathy. But what you lost was compulsion. What you gained was choice. The end of emotional availability is not rejection. It is sovereignty. You no longer respond because you are needed. You respond only when it is aligned. Jung believed this moment marked the true beginning of individuation. The psyche stops orbiting others and begins to orient around the self. This is terrifying for those who depended on your dysregulation. They escalate. They create urgency. They manufacture emergencies. They test boundaries to see if the old access still exists. But you see it now. And because you see it, it no longer works. Your calm becomes disruptive. Your silence becomes confrontational. Your lack of reaction becomes power. Jung wrote that unconscious people experience conscious boundaries as aggression, not because boundaries harm them, but because boundaries end extraction. This is why your peace provokes anger, why your stability feels offensive, why your absence creates chaos in systems that relied on your presence to function. You are no longer feeding the dynamic. And without fuel, it collapses. The empath who survives this stage realizes something irreversible. They were never responsible for holding others together. They were never meant to be the emotional infrastructure of broken systems. Their role was to become whole, and wholeness requires limits. Jung taught that true compassion is selective. It flows where there is reciprocity, accountability, and consciousness. Anything else is sacrifice disguised as virtue. This is the end of emotional availability, and the beginning of emotional authority. You are still empathic, but now your empathy serves truth, not survival. And that changes everything. There is something Jung observed that unsettles people more than anger, more than confrontation, more than rebellion. Calm. Not passive calm, not suppressed calm, but integrated calm. When an empath survives psychological destruction and emerges regulated, centered, and unmoved, the entire power dynamic collapses. Because manipulation depends on reaction. Jung understood that unconscious people rely on emotional disturbance to feel control. They provoke, they confuse, they destabilize. And when none of it works, they feel exposed. Your calm becomes a mirror they cannot escape. They escalate not because you are doing something wrong, but because their old strategies no longer penetrate your psyche. You are no longer reactive, no longer defensive, no longer explaining. Jung called this the withdrawal of projections. When others can no longer unload their shadow onto you, they are forced to carry it themselves. This is unbearable for many. They accuse you of being cold, of being distant, of having changed. But what they are really saying is, I can no longer reach you. And that terrifies them. The empath who has integrated their shadow radiates psychological authority without speaking. Your nervous system no longer vibrates in response to manipulation. Your body no longer flinches at guilt. Your mind no longer negotiates with false urgency. You are calm because nothing is hooking you anymore. Jung believed this state marked the collapse of unconscious contracts, invisible agreements where you once agreed to absorb chaos in exchange for belonging. You have silently revoked the contract. And the system notices. Your calm destabilizes those who relied on your dysregulation. Your boundaries feel like rejection because they end access. Your silence feels violent because it ends influence. Jung wrote that when the unconscious loses control, it calls the conscious cruel. But cruelty has nothing to do with it. This is alignment. You are no longer managing other people's emotions. You are no longer translating their pain. You are no longer cushioning reality for them. And without your buffering presence, they must finally face themselves. This is why your calm feels threatening. It is not passive, it is sovereign. The empath who reaches this stage realizes something profound. Peace is not weakness, it is power that no longer leaks. Jung believed that true strength is quiet because it does not need to prove itself. And when you embody this, people feel it immediately. Some will retreat, some will attack, some will attempt reconciliation through control. But none of it works. because you are no longer available for unconscious engagement. Your calm is not an absence of feeling. It is feeling that has been integrated, metabolized, and mastered. And once this happens, you cannot return to who you were before. This is not healing, this is evolution. And it cannot be undone. Jung noticed a final pattern that appears right before manipulation collapses completely. It always escalates. Not because it is becoming stronger, but because it is dying. When unconscious control stops working, it panics. The narcissist does not escalate because they miss you. They escalate because the system they relied on is failing. They increase contact. They manufacture urgency. They create crises. They revive old stories. They rewrite history. They suddenly remember your importance. Jung understood this as the last convulsion of a collapsing complex. An unconscious pattern does not surrender quietly. It thrashes. Because for years your emotional availability stabilized their inner chaos. Your empathy regulated what they could not regulate themselves. And now that you are gone, not physically but psychologically, they are alone with the very darkness they externalized onto you. This is why the escalation feels frantic, disorganized, contradictory. One moment they idealize you, the next they devalue you. Then they accuse you of abandonment. Then they claim they never needed you. Jung wrote that the unconscious reveals itself most clearly when it is threatened. And what threatens it most is indifference. Not coldness, not revenge, but the absence of participation. You are no longer feeding the dynamic. You are no longer arguing, no longer clarifying, no longer defending, no longer reacting. And without reaction, manipulation has nothing to grip. This is the moment when many empaths doubt themselves. They think, maybe I'm being cruel. Maybe I should explain. Maybe I owe closure. But Jung was clear. Explaining to unconsciousness does not heal it, it empowers it. Every explanation is an opening. Every justification is a door. Every emotional response is supply. The escalation is not a request, it is a test. They are checking whether the old access still exists. And when you do nothing, when you remain centered, grounded, unreachable, the test fails. This is when manipulation begins to dissolve. Not dramatically, but quietly, like a fire starved of oxygen. Jung believed that power based on projection collapses the moment the mirror is removed. And you are no longer a mirror for their fantasy. You are no longer a container for their chaos. You have exited the psychological stage entirely. This is why the final phase feels eerie. The noise increases briefly, then suddenly, nothing. Silence. Not peace for them, but exposure. They are left with themselves. And you are left with something you have never had before. Freedom that does not require explanation. This is the true end of the dynamic. Not when they understand, not when they apologize, but when they can no longer reach you. And once this line is crossed, there is no return. The game does not restart, because you are no longer inside it. When you stop participating in the old dynamic, something unsettling happens to the people who once held power over you. They don't feel anger first. They feel collapse. Carl Jung observed that what most people call power is not inner authority, but borrowed energy, control maintained through unconscious agreement. The moment you withdraw that agreement, the structure fails. This is why they suddenly seem smaller, not weaker in appearance, but hollow. You didn't grow arrogant. You simply stopped feeding an illusion that required your compliance to exist. Jung understood this as the collapse of the projected self. The narcissist's sense of dominance was never self-generated. It existed only in relation to your availability. When you individuate, when you step into psychological sovereignty, you don't attack their power. You remove the mirror that made it feel real. And without that mirror, they are forced to confront something terrifying. There is nothing behind the performance. This is why they escalate, not because they miss you, but because they are witnessing the death of a role they depended on to feel alive. Jung called this the withdrawal of projection. When the unconscious can no longer export its darkness, it must either integrate it or collapse under its own weight. Most choose collapse. This is why they try to provoke you, why they attempt to re-enter your field with confusion, charm, guilt, or manufactured crises. They are not seeking connection. They are seeking restoration of a hierarchy that no longer exists. Your calm is not kindness, it is finality. You no longer react because there is nothing left to negotiate. No energy left to extract, no wound left to press. Jung wrote that true authority emerges when the ego no longer needs confirmation. That is what you have become. Not dominant, not vengeful, but structurally unreachable. This is the moment when they realize something irreversible. You did not leave the battlefield, you dissolved it. And without a battlefield, there can be no victor. Only someone standing alone with their own shadow. That is the true collapse they feel. Not loss of you, but loss of the illusion that they were ever above you. After the collapse, something subtler begins to emerge. And this is where the transformation becomes irreversible. Jung noticed that once projection fails, unconscious people experience a strange form of vertigo. They no longer know who they are in relation to you. For years, their identity depended on contrast. You were the patient one, the forgiving one, the one who absorbed and adjusted. When that role disappears, they don't just lose access to you, they lose orientation. This is why they often rewrite history. They minimize what happened. They distort your boundaries into cruelty. They recast your silence as coldness. Jung understood this as ego fragmentation. When the psyche cannot integrate reality, it edits it. But here's the crucial shift. You no longer feel the need to correct the narrative. The old you would have explained, clarified, defended, offered context. The individuated you understands something deeper. Truth does not require agreement to remain true. Jung wrote that consciousness reaches maturity when it no longer needs to be mirrored back by others. This is the point where your inner authority stabilizes. You stop asking, "Do they understand me?" and begin living from, "I understand myself." This is the moment your nervous system recalibrates. Your body no longer prepares for emotional impact. Your mind no longer scans for threat. Your energy no longer leaks toward justification. You are not braced, you are grounded. And this grounded presence does something extraordinary. It reveals who is capable of relationship and who was only capable of extraction. Those who were feeding disappear. Those who were projecting grow uncomfortable. Those who were unconscious feel exposed. But something else happens too. People who have done their own inner work begin to recognize you immediately. There is no performance, no proving, no testing, just resonance. Jung believed that individuation creates a silent signal, not visible, not verbal, but unmistakable to those who are awake. You are no longer broadcasting need, you are broadcasting coherence. And coherence is magnetic, but only to those who can meet it without fear. This is why your circle grows smaller, but infinitely cleaner. You didn't lose people, you lost roles. And in their absence, you finally stand as yourself, not as a function, not as a container, but as a complete psychological organism. This is not healing, this is arrival. At this stage, the transformation becomes visible, not through words but through absence. Jung observed that the individuated person does not announce boundaries, they embody them. You no longer explain why you're unavailable, you simply are. And this is deeply unsettling to anyone who relied on access rather than intimacy. Unconscious people experience this as abandonment. Manipulative people experience it as loss of control. But psychologically, something more precise is happening. They are encountering what Jung called the limit of projection. They can no longer place their chaos inside you. They can no longer outsource regulation. They can no longer disown responsibility through you. So they feel empty. And instead of asking why, they ask where you went. But you didn't go anywhere. You returned to yourself. This is why guilt stops working, why urgency loses its pull, why emotional bait feels obvious instead of compelling. Your nervous system has exited survival mode. Jung understood that true power emerges when the psyche no longer oscillates between defense and appeasement. You are no longer reacting. You are responding, selectively. This is the birth of psychological sovereignty. Not dominance, not control, but self-governance. You choose when to engage. You choose how deeply. You choose who has access to your inner world. And you choose without apology. Jung wrote that the individuated person does not seek harmony at the expense of truth. They seek alignment, even if it costs comfort. This is why your life begins to reorganize quietly. Relationships either deepen or dissolve. Conversations either gain substance or end. Environments either support growth or feel intolerable. You don't force these changes. Your presence initiates them. Because you are no longer fragmenting yourself to fit distorted systems. And here is the paradox Jung loved. The more whole you become, the less effort life requires. Drama fades, confusion diminishes, compulsion loosens its grip. Not because the world improved, but because you stopped negotiating with what diminishes you. This is the stage where peace is no longer fragile. It's structural, built on self-trust, anchored in clarity, maintained by discernment. You are no longer healing from the narcissist. You have outgrown the psychological ecosystem that required them. And once this happens, there is no return. Only refinement. Jung understood that the final stage of individuation is not triumph. It is quiet authority. You stop proving, you stop correcting, you stop rescuing. Not because you no longer care, but because you finally care in the right direction. Inward. The empath who survives the narcissist's darkness does not become hardened. They become precise. They know when to feel, they know when to step back. They know when silence is more honest than explanation. This is not emotional shutdown. It is emotional maturity. Jung warned that those who awaken from unconscious bonds often appear colder to those who benefited from their warmth. But this is illusion. What disappeared was access, not compassion. Your empathy didn't die, it integrated. It now answers to discernment instead of guilt, to truth instead of urgency, to self-respect instead of fear. This is why manipulation fails, because it requires unconscious participation, and you are no longer unconscious. You are no longer available to be misread, misused, or mistaken for a container. You have become a boundary with a heart. Jung believed that individuation was not selfishness but responsibility. The responsibility to stop living as a fragment of other people's unresolved wounds. You didn't lose your softness, you learned where it belongs. You didn't become distant, you became self-possessed. You didn't change into someone unrecognizable. You returned to who you were before survival taught you to disappear. This is what the narcissist never saw coming. Not revenge, not confrontation, but freedom. And freedom needs no audience. It simply lives. If you recognize yourself in this transformation, know this. Your sensitivity was never your weakness. Your silence was never submission. And your healing was never meant to return you to what broke you. It was meant to return you to yourself. And that is sovereignty. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to breathe and remember that awareness grows when it's shared. Subscribe so you don't lose your way when the next reflection arrives. Leave a like. It helps this message reach others who need to hear it but don't yet know why. And share your thoughts below, because every comment here becomes a spark. One awakened mind helping another remember. Together, we move beyond the dark.